What's up, everybody? Zach McDonald, your real estate agent with Real Property Associates, and I've got with me Bill Kessler from Beresford Booth. Thanks for joining us today, Bill.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. Well, if you don't mind, can you introduce yourself so everybody can get to know you a little bit, and then we'll kind of jump into the interview a little bit.
Sure. Again, my name is Bill Kessler. I'm a business and real estate lawyer at the firm of Beresford Booth. We are in downtown Edmonds. I do a lot of business law on the transactional side as well as the litigation side, and I do a lot of real estate law on both the transactional and litigation side. And have worked with Zach for several years, and happy to be here to talk with you guys a bit about tenancies in common and LLCs and people buying properties together in general, I think.
So, Bill, as we kind of get started with this conversation, something that is super common right now is people starting to buy homes together. In the past, people might buy a home together if they were in a serious relationship or family members, which I think is important for us to talk about too. But we're also seeing as home prices rise, maybe friends buying houses together, business partners buying houses together to help offset some of the cost burden. It's been more common in more expensive markets for a long time, and now we're starting to see that here in the Seattle area. So can you speak to that a little bit and what kind of advice you give people when they're thinking about purchasing a home, and maybe start with a couple that's dating or something like that, and then we can kind of progress towards people that are buying as maybe business partners.
Sure. Yeah, I'd say there's kind of three categories of people that buy together. One would be people that are dating. Another would be friends who are intending to live together. And then a third category would be people who are buying a piece of investment property together that they don't intend to live in. So we'll start with the first category you mentioned, which is people who are dating. And that is, there's a legal relationship there that's important to set up the right way at the outset. And that's true regardless of how people who are not married are buying together. They need to set up their legal relationship at the outset. And that does two things. One, it lets them it lets them have a document at the end of the day that if things don't go right, a document they can rely on. And most people think about that. They think, well, you know, we should have a contract, so if things go south, we've got a document to rely on. But also, an underappreciated reason for having a contract is, regardless of the relationship situation, a good reason for having a contract is so you address the issues up front. And there might be some issues that you or your significant other or your business partner or your friends or whatever are thinking about, but you haven't crystallized those issues. And so having a contract and having a lawyer help you address these issues squarely and clearly really crystallizes the issues and helps people. The contract just doesn't help them have a document in case things go wrong, but it helps them really think clearly about their business relationship and makes them much more comfortable as they have clear eyes as they go into that purchase. So anyway, when you have people who are dating and not married that buy a property together, they should have what's called an agreement regarding status of property. It's very similar to a prenup, and people think, well, wait a minute, we're not intending to be married, or we don't know whether we're going to get married, we're just buying a piece of property together. But there's still a document that you need because you'll acquire, and I'm not a family law lawyer or divorce lawyer, but my law partner is, and this is a big piece of what these folks do is if you own a piece of property together and you're both working, or even if you're not both working, you own it together and it appreciates and you're sharing household expenses, you're gaining, you're at a risk of forming what's called a committed intimate relationship in the eyes of the law, a CIR. Yeah, it used to be called a meretricious relationship. And if a judge later, if you were to break up, there could be a lawsuit and the judge could find that a committed intimate relationship existed. And if that happened, then the judge would be dividing, it's called quasi-community property. So you might think, oh, well, what's his is his and what's hers is hers. and you keep your bank account separate, but that doesn't matter. If there's a CIR, all that's blended, and the judge is dividing it just like a divorce. They call it quasi-community property, but it's the same thing functionally. So,
Gotcha.
so you want what's the equivalent of a prenup or we call it an agreement regarding status of property. It can be called all kinds of different things, but it's basically a prenup. So that's the document that those folks are going to want to have.
And it spells out what happens if there is a breakup in that relationship, or
Correct.
They decide that they want to sell the house. It tells everybody what's going to happen, right?
That's exactly right. It's just like a prenup, and people kind of think of a prenup like, all right, it deals with our assets if we go our separate ways. Same exact thing, just without the marriage. But again, in Washington, you have a high risk of acquiring that quasi-community property together, and so you need to have that contract that deals with it, or it could be a mess.
Hey,
yeah.
I mean, getting clarity is super important. We deal with it in real estate contracts. You deal with it too. It's really important to make sure we're clear about how the process is supposed to go and how everything's handled. So makes sense to have that on the personal side too. What differences are there? So if we're in a situation where maybe somebody's buying it with a friend, what does that look like? It's a little different than a dating or marriage relationship.
Yeah.
What is the difference in how they should approach buying together as friends?
Yeah, I'm seeing a big uptick in people buying property together who are not dating, and they're not just doing it as business partners, buying an investment property together. That's always been sort of common, but very common now for people who want to live in the house, who are buying, like two couples buying together, or two single people who are friends buying together, simply to be able to afford the place, because obviously real estate prices around here are so expensive.
Definitely.
So as you touched on, Zach, you've got people in other markets like LA, San Francisco, New York that have been doing this for a while now, and it's becoming more and more common in Seattle. And I don't know how many I've done over the last year or so, probably a dozen, where you've got friends, whether it's individuals or couples, that are buying together and intending to live under the same roof. So it makes a lot of business sense. I think it's a great opportunity for people, but it's got to be done the right way. And people know that intuitively. They think they start thinking of possible issues just like anybody normally would off the top of their head. But what's super important for those couples to do, or I'll say a couple, I'll use an example of two couples buying together, both intending to live at the property and use it as their primary residence for tax purposes and otherwise, then it's important for them to do that the right way, and to have a contract that governs that.
What does that look like? I mean, what kind of a contract should they have in place? I'm assuming it's a little different than if they were in a committed relationship together. Right,
very different. Yeah. So they are. What'll happen when people buy together and they want to live in the property as their primary residence, they want to live in it as tenants in common. They want to own it as tenants in common, and that is it's a strange term. It's an old English term. It sounds like you're renting something. You're like, tenants. What does that mean? Sometimes some people have heard the term joint tenants with right of survivorship. That's usually like husband and wife on a bank account. It's very common. But joint or tenants in common is the default way that two people would own a piece of property. So if you and your wife and me and my wife bought a piece of property together, and we got under the purchase and sale agreement, and it just said our names, and then we went and closed. All the buyers' names are right there on the deed. So it's Jane and Bob Smith convey to Bill and Zach and Christina and Holly. It's just like all our names are right there on the deed. So if you look at that deed you take from your seller and all the names are all there, tenants in common is how you own it. And there's a whole bunch of laws that just automatically apply to you when you own as tenants in common. And a lot of them aren't really good. They're not really good. They're not for the people who own together. But it's how you have to own, or it's how you should own if you're going. In most people's cases, it's how you should own if you're going to claim that property as your primary residence for tax purposes. So that's the business relationship is called a tenancy in common. And then you have a contract, not an agreement regarding status of property. That's for couples.
Yep.
You have a contract called a tenancy in common agreement, or the slang for it is a TIC, a TIC, and that's your partnership deal with your co-owners, is a TIC.
So in a TIC, what are a couple of the things that are really important in the TIC that help make it a little bit more clear as to how the relationship's handled versus if you just went ahead and did it without the agreement?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the TIC answers questions for people, and it kind of narrows the focus from what people think of in kind of an amorphous way into a more specific agreement. So it answers what if questions. What if I want to refi? And Zach doesn't want to refi? What if I want to sell and Zach doesn't? What if Zach wants to bring in a tenant and I don't? Rent out a room to somebody else and I don't? What if Zach wants to remodel and I don't? What if Zach and I get sick of each other and don't want to live there anymore? Yeah, right. It answers what if questions. Who pays what expenses? What happens if I pay more than Zach does? What happens if he pays more than I do? I tell Zach not to remodel, but I come home and he's got a construction project going on. What, right? What do we do? What if we just can't resolve our differences? What do we do if we have big differences and we can't resolve them? How do we get those resolved? Do we have to resort to courts, or do we have alternative dispute resolution methods that we can implement that are streamlined for co-owners like us and not made for multi-million-dollar disputes? So there's all these questions that can be answered inside that TIC, and it really helps people on the front end get their focus narrowed and answer those questions and get real comfortable with each other, rather than just wondering what those issues.
Yeah, that's right. It's going to go well.
That's right.
It does sometimes, right?
That's right. Waking up at 2 a.m. and go, what about this situation? You answer all those things in the contract up front. So,
and you guys get paid to think through those things and do this on a regular basis versus somebody just.
Right. That's
what situation? Googling, essentially.
Yeah, that's the service we provide is to give them that product, but also to provide independent and detached legal advice and judgment that helps people that where we can provide that dispassionate analysis and also not just the product at the end of the day, but going through the process of creating that product that is going to give people that comfort and that peace of mind that they've addressed all the issues that they need to address before they get in.
That's great.
Get into the relationship.
Yeah. Well, thanks for giving us a little bit of an education on the TICs. Now, if we were to address a situation where there's a business partners buying a property together, now I start to think about is that where you bring in an LLC versus a TIC? When do we start to differentiate between the two? Because an LLC is an entity, whereas the TIC is more of a contract on how things are handled. Are there situations where you have both? Are there situations where you would prefer to do an LLC and create an entity versus having the TIC agreement?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the example that you're given is change it up so our wives and we are not buying a place to live and together, but you and I are buying an investment piece of property to put a tenant in, right? Okay. So we're going to buy a single family home. We're going to pool our resources and put a tenant in there. And the answer is almost certainly you'd want to own that in an LLC, or you and I would want to own that property in an LLC, which is a limited liability company is the acronym. So a lot of people would think of having that situation where the two couples are buying together and living together. They'd be like, well, why don't you put that in an LLC? The short answer is there's a lot of tax disadvantages to putting your primary residence in an LLC, and you also lose what's called a homestead exemption. So you're actually exposed to more liability and cost by putting your primary residence into an LLC. It's the short answer. My partner on our firm's website, my partner has a really nice, succinct little blog post on that. So, but the moral of the story is don't put your primary residence into an LLC. Versus what Zach's talking about now, which is us buying together as an investment. And in that situation, almost certainly we're going to want an LLC.
Okay.
So for asset protection purposes, an LLC it's a person for legal purposes. It has its own liability. And if you form it the right way and you operate it the right way, then the liability of the LLC doesn't go outside of the assets inside of the LLC. And in this case, it's going to be a single purpose, single asset LLC. The only thing in it is going to be the property, the investment property that we've purchased together.
Yep.
So to answer your question, yeah, we want an LLC and not a TIC. The LLC provides that liability protection, whereas the TIC does not.
Yep.
Now, functionally, there's a contract called an LLC agreement, which you'll hear called an operating agreement. And the operating agreement and an LLC agreement, same thing. But they also an LLC agreement and a TIC are functionally the same thing. They answer most of the same questions. I suppose TICs could deal with specifics of the relationship, the physical living together relationship, and who's able to access what part of the house and when, and you can get kind of specific in a TIC that way, which is great. With an LLC, not really as necessary to get into those details because you don't have those details. But the LLC agreement or operating agreement still answers the same basic questions about the what if questions that I went through before about people having disagreement about the operation of the business, the rental business.
So the LLC defines the relationship, but it also creates some legal protections that the TIC doesn't.
Correct. So if you operate the LLC the right way, you own the property in it, you have a bank account for the LLC, you have your LLC agreement governing that relationship. The lease you have with your tenant is the landlord is the LLC. It's not Zach and Bill together. It's our LLC. It's its own person. And kind of the simplest way to think about it is if we treat the LLC as its own person with its own assets and its own ability to do things legally. If we treat it that way, then the court is going to treat it that way. I always tell people an LLC is like a hurdle. I describe it as a hurdle between your assets, say your house and your own personal bank accounts, and a plaintiff's lawyer. And that plaintiff's lawyer is trying to jump over that hurdle and get into your personal assets in a lawsuit. And the better the LLC is formed, the more cleanly it is formed, and the more cleanly it is operated while it's existing, the more cleanly you operate and correctly you operate that business in the LLC, the higher that hurdle becomes. And it's not an absolute bar, but it becomes awfully hard to clear when you do things the right way as the LLC owner. So that's the third way, the LLC.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Yep.
So, are there other types of agreements or entities that people should consider when they're buying properties together in other situations?
Yeah, sometimes not. The short version is not usually. Like we're talking about a relatively small number of people buying together, and if again a tenancy in common if they're going to live together, and generally an LLC if they're doing it as an investment. There are other entities out there. There's like an LLP, a limited liability partnership. You could, in theory, own through a general partnership where we just form an entity we call the Zach and Bill partnership, and then we have, there's no reason to do that though, because then we would have a full liability for everything that we did together owning that piece of property, the same way we would as a TIC. But we'd have a tenant, we'd have all this liability out there and no asset protection shell around it.
Seems inferior to an LLC,
right. There's
an
just
LLC operating agreement.
Exactly. So as a practical matter, it's very, very rare that you'd consider, at least in Washington, in the circumstances that you and I are talking about, it's really rare that you would have an entity other than an LLC owning real estate. And a TIC, to be clear, is not an entity. It's a TIC it can be a little confusing because the contract that governs our relationship, if we're living together with our families in one house, that relationship is a tenancy in common, which is a TIC. But then the contract, the slang for the contract, is also a TIC. But that's not a legal entity. That's just the default. That's the name for the way the law treats our relationship. It calls it a tenancy in common. It's the default way that we're treated when we're all on the deed together. And again, no asset protection there.
Okay.
It's all personal liability.
So I want to bring this conversation back and rewind it to a place when you said that if you're buying a primary residence for yourself, you don't want to necessarily put it in an LLC. Mm-hmm. And I'd be curious to hear you, and I'm sure people watching would love to hear you expand on that a little bit.
Yeah.
What are some of the negatives or some of the cons to putting a primary residence into an LLC?
Yeah, so there's a few tax negatives. Again, that blog post my partner Dave Tingstad has done on beresfordlaw.com is good. It's by far our most viewed article.
Okay. Yeah, we'll make that available to the viewers. So
yeah,
maybe link
check
it
that
up
out.
down below on YouTube.
But yeah, I mean, number one, so when you have a primary residence, you have a shield against capital gain tax when you sell it. If you're living it as your primary residence and you're on the deed, even if, let's say, I keep using the example of your wife and you
Sounds like
and
you
my
wanna buy a
wife and
house
me.
together
Let's
or
buy.
something
Let's
like
all
that.
live together. We're gonna have a commune.
That lake house is happening this summer now.
There you go.
Kirkland waterfront. Here we go.
That's right. Look out. So if we do that and we put our property into an LLC, and then we when we go to sell, we're not going to be able to shield any of the capital gains. Right now, if my wife and I sell our house, we have $250,000 each of shield against capital gain, meaning the capital gain doesn't kick in until you get over $500,000 of gain.
Yeah, same
with you, and same with everybody in America. So you have this shield against capital gain. If you have it in an LLC, you don't have that shield because the shield is only for your primary residence. And you're like, oh, wait a minute, but we live there. And you're like, no, you might live there, but you've chosen to treat it like a business. So the LLC needs to have a legitimate business purpose. So that's why, for example, you don't put like your regular stocks and bonds account into an LLC because there's no legitimate business purpose for having your personal brokerage account in an LLC. There's no business there. Whereas if you and I own the rental together, we've got a business together. We've got a rental property, which is itself a business. So we've got a legitimate business purpose. So you've got that big tax disadvantage. And then there's also, I mentioned the homestead exemption. So what that means is if you get sued personally and there's a judgment entered against you personally, then you've got a certain amount of equity in your home that is protected, so that if the judgment creditor, someone has a judgment against you and they go force the sale of your home, which they can do if they have a judgment against you personally, not against McDonald, not against your business and not against your LLC, whatever, but against you personally, then they can force the sale of your home. Well, if they do that, the first, in King County, the homestead exemption has gone up to, it's a weird number, it's like $750,000 or so, but it's this like, anyway, it's the median home price, I think is what they did, and they made that the homestead exemption. Snohomish County is the same. I think it's like $500,000 or something. So the homestead used to be $125,000, and now it's gone up.
That's a substantial change.
It's a big change. So your house is now a lot more of an asset protection vehicle even than it used to be, and it already was reasonably good. So your personal residence, you've got unlimited homestead, I think, in both Texas and Florida, which is why OJ lives in Florida. Because you could buy a multi-million-dollar house and they could get their giant judgment and execute on it, but they can't get any of the proceeds. All the money would go back to OJ. So you've got homesteads. And Washington's homestead got a lot better. So you don't want to have your primary residence in an LLC.
Yeah. No, those are some good reasons not to.
Yeah.
And while we're talking about LLCs, I think this is a good tactical question. People that are buying rental properties and investing in rental properties, do you typically advise people to buy multiple properties in one LLC, or do you have them put each property in their own LLC? I see it both ways, and maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, the reasoning behind handling it with a single LLC for each property and maybe having certain properties in the same LLC together.
Yeah, I would say in this part of the country, property's worth a lot. Even a bare piece of land is still, worth six figures, mid six figures, whatever. And LLCs are cheap to form and maintain. They're easy and cheap to form and maintain. So the answer is I would have, in almost every situation, I would have every tax parcel in a separate LLC. Because the cost benefit is just, it makes a ton of sense to do it. And the law is going to allow you to treat each tax parcel as its own business. So take advantage of that. An LLC is another way I described it as a hurdle before. Another way to look at it is insurance. It's just cheap insurance. Mm-hmm. It's cheap additional insurance. I hear a lot of people say, well, I have insurance. Why would I need an LLC? I'd say, because why do you want to rest on the limits of your insurance? Why do you want to strain that insurance policy when you could supercharge that insurance policy with an LLC?
Just having an LLC.
That's it. So it's cheap insurance. Do it. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, it's not expensive to form and maintain an LLC.
And it seems like a no-brainer then.
In most cases, it's a total no-brainer.
So when would you put multiple properties into one LLC? When might that be an appropriate decision? I
see people do it when they've got like they've got one contiguous area of land and they think of it as one. They think of it as one property. Like, let's say you have a big piece of residential property and the house sits on one part and it feels like just one big yard or a piece of forest or something, and then they'll have, but really those are two extra tax parcels that are attached. Then people just say, well, that's just that's this one project. One project, and we'll stick the whole thing in. Sometimes that makes sense, but again, properties are so valuable around here that the cost benefit almost never comes out in favor of a single entity. Just have 3 LLCs, protect each one.
More insurance,
and it's all cheap compared to the value. So
yeah, well, you've given some really good thoughts on LLCs and TICs. Is there anything else that you were wanting to share in regards to the different entities, or just in general with the audience here today before we kind of wrap up?
I'd say it's just it's something that buying a house together or buying a piece of investment property, even if you're not doing it together with other people, is it's just something you want professionals involved in. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're in the business of helping people buy and sell houses. Whenever somebody's doing that, it's almost always one of, if not the largest financial transactions in their life going on at that time, and probably ever in their life. And having a professional involved in that is hugely important. And when you take, and that's just buying your own residence, say by yourself or with your spouse, that's without partners. Still, you want that professional involved. If you're going to take the next step and add a layer of complexity by having partners, that might be a really good financial decision for you, but it also adds a layer of legal complexity that needs counsel. Mm-hmm. You need independent, sound counsel who's going to walk you through that that project. And when people go do that by themselves and they draw up their own agreements, I call it self-surgery, you know. I mean, a doctor could probably give you a spinal and teach you how to take your own appendix out, but that sounds like a bad idea. Now that's
It's a terrible visual. Yeah.
It's a terrible visual, right? No, I'm being extreme and ridiculous for the purpose of making a point, but but it really is it's not a good idea to engage in the largest financial transaction in your life.
Go at it
solo when the cost benefit weighs heavily in favor of having a professional help you out with it. So,
I agree with you.
Anyway.
Well, thanks so much for coming on with us today, and just really appreciate your insight and friendship and all the advice that you've given me and clients. So really appreciate having you on today.
Thanks for having me, Zach. And you know, there's a lot more hot air in the room now, but at least you hung in there with me.
I can do it.
All right.
I can do it. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching this video interview with Bill Kessler and talking a little bit about the different entities and ways to buy real estate together. I hope this video was super valuable for you. And if you want to talk more about buying and selling real estate here in Washington State, I'd love to be a resource for you. And if you want to talk with Bill a little bit more about how to structure a purchase or come up with some of these agreements that he mentioned in the video, I'm going to link up his contact information below, and you can always reach out to me for it as well.